you feel about reading assignments? When you have to read a textbook or an article for class, do you feel a little bit overwhelmed? Do you find it really hard to complete the reading assignment? Or do you just want to pull your hair out? Reading assignments can be difficult to complete. Part of the problem is that textbooks tend to make us a little bit confused. If we don't understand the material, if we don't know the jargon or the vocabulary that's being used, we don't always necessarily understand what we read. The other part of the problem, though, is that we simply just don't engage in the reading. It's not interesting to us. We have other things we'd rather be doing. We're trying to rush through it to get it done, and we end up not remembering anything we've read. But there is a way to make this process a whole lot easier, to make sure that you remember what you read, and to make reading a little less stressful. And that process is called active reading. So what is active reading? Well, let's start by thinking of the word active. When you're doing something actively, it means you're engaging in it. And even more importantly, it means you're doing something. So think of the way you tend to read now. You pick up a magazine, you look at an article on the internet, you pick up your book, and you just sit there and read. But are you really doing anything? No, you are reading passively, meaning you're just sitting there hoping to be a sponge that soaks up the information automatically. But learning doesn't work that way, and certainly learning through reading doesn't work that way. Instead, you need to actually be doing the reading. So what does that mean? Well, there are 3 steps to active reading that help you remember the content, engage in the reading, and make sure you're actually doing something while you read so that you don't get as bored and you understand it better. Those 3 steps are pre-reading, reading, and reviewing. So let's start with pre-reading. What does that mean? Well, it means exactly what it sounds like. It means you read before you read. Wait, what? Did I really just say that? I did. Doesn't mean you're going to read the whole textbook chapter twice. I mean, you can if you want to, and you probably would retain a little bit more information, but that's not even necessary. All it means is that you take just a little bit of time to skim through the text before you read. But you're doing this purposely. You're not just flipping the pages to see how long it is or looking at how many pictures there are to see if the chapter is really shorter than it seems. Instead, you're looking for specific things. So in the pre-reading stage, you want to look at the chapter table of contents. This will tell you the types of subtopics you're going to encounter in the chapter. You also want to look at the chapter's learning objectives. What is it exactly you're supposed to get out of the chapter? And then after you've read it, did you actually get those things? You want to look at the headings and subheadings. This gives you a huge clue as to how the chapter is organized and what topics will be included. You also want to look at any bold or vocabulary words. Those are probably things you're supposed to know. You want to look at anything that is highlighted or boxed or in a different color. If something looks different on the page, it does that for a reason. It's because it's important and you're supposed to see it and you're supposed to pay attention to it. You also want to look at the chapter summary at the end. Do you recognize everything that was in there? By the time you're done reading, you should know all those things. So looking at all of this information up front will help you understand what you're going to be reading later. Let's look at a sample of a textbook to see how this process would work. So this is the first chapter of an anatomy and physiology textbook. And I have to be honest with you, I would find this reading assignment a little bit intimidating up front. However, I know that if I followed the active reading process, this wouldn't be too bad. So I would start with looking at the learning outcomes at the beginning of the chapter. This is telling me everything I'm supposed to learn as I read the chapter, and it gives me a better idea as to the things that I should look for and pay attention to as I read. Then I'll look at the way that the chapter is organized. Here I have headings. I have an introduction to studying the human body. I have subheadings. All living things display responsiveness, growth, reproduction, movement, and metabolism. I bet there's more subheadings further on in the text. Yep, anatomy, types of anatomy, anatomy is structure. I also have a lot of bold words here. These must all be vocabulary words for things that I'm supposed to know what they are, or if I don't, I need to pay attention to make sure that I will know what they are. There's a checkpoint here with a question. That's in a little sort of side box all by itself, so it's probably indicating that I'm supposed to be able to answer that question by the time I get to this checkpoint. And so I just continue looking at it that way. And then here I have something that looks completely different than all the other pages. I have this dark, bright border at the top. I have a spotlight, a figure. Anytime a publisher or a textbook author takes the time to put in an image, it's to help you understand the information better. So those are usually pretty important. And skipping ahead a few pages in this chapter, I found the chapter review. This is nicely organized with a summary outline. I should just take a look at this just to get a better idea of the different things I should learn by the time I've read the chapter. There are also a series of review questions at the end. Now, I don't necessarily need to complete these unless my instructor assigns them, but it does give me an idea of the types of things that I will learn in this chapter. And that is what pre-reading looks like. See, that didn't take too long. The second step in the active reading process is reading. Now that I've looked at the chapter ahead of time and I've identified how the chapter is organized and what it is I'm going to be reading about, I can now go through and read the chapter. But this doesn't mean read in the same way that you've always read, because then you're not doing anything. This means read by paying attention. So you should take notes. You should highlight things that seem important. You should write down questions as they come up in your mind. You should identify any connections between different parts of the chapter. Take special note of vocabulary words. Doing this does make the reading take longer. I know, that's not what you want to hear. But it makes you pay attention as you're reading and make sure that you get those important things out of the reading. That way you'll remember what you've read and you don't have to go back and read it again while you study for a test because you've forgotten everything that you've read. Instead, you can just look at your notes. And then the third step in the active reading process is reviewing. This doesn't necessarily mean you have to reread the chapter. What this means is that you review your notes, you look at your questions, and you try to answer them. Now, you might need to revisit the chapter to be able to answer your questions. And if there are any questions that you can't answer, you identify what you want to ask your instructor about. You know, your instructor assigns the reading assignment because they want you to have this knowledge, and they're going to be doing something in class to interact with this knowledge or to use this knowledge. But if you don't understand it, you need to ask the questions to make sure you have the knowledge before class begins. And then that's it. That's the three-step process to active reading. Pre-read, take a look at the chapter to see what you're going to be learning, read while taking notes, and then review your notes. And it's that simple. But this active reading process doesn't just apply to reading assignments in class. It also applies to any other type of document you interact with every day, including documents in the workplace. Let's look at an example of a memo and see how we can apply the active reading process to that memo. So here's a memo. This is a standard business document that gets written and created and distributed in almost every organization on the planet. The purpose of the memo is to share a small piece of information with a lot of people at once. It's a little bit more formal than an email, so people tend to pay more attention to a memo when it's distributed. So if we apply the active reading process to this, we're going to start with pre-reading. We're going to look at the memo and see what it is that this is all about. So here I have the title, or the company it's from, and then I have the who this is going to. So it's going to everybody, which means it's information everyone needs to know. And it's about changes in expense report receipt policy. That's the equivalent of looking at the title in the textbook. I have some things in bold here: food expenses, non-food expenses, and tips. And so these would be the same as headings in a textbook. And this is very short. It's only one page. I have a date here. I have some dollar signs. Those numbers stand out to me. So when I read, I know I need to really pay attention to the numbers in the document. Now my pre-reading's done. So now I'm going to read it. So reading this document, I see that the company's expense report receipt policy will change effective February 1st. And this is coming out in January. So I only have about 3 weeks to really make sure I understand this policy so that I can implement the changes. I probably would want to highlight this date or jot down a note that it's changing. These changes are based on the recommendations of the auditing task force. The changes outlined below apply to all expense reports, including those for non-travel expenses. So now I know that reading the rest of this is going to tell me what the specific changes are. Food expenses. All food expenses, regardless of amount, must be accompanied by an itemized receipt. Employees will not be reimbursed for food expenses that are not accompanied by an itemized receipt, regardless of the amount of the expense. Okay, so I could continue to read this, but the point is that I can see here that I'm going to look at changes of food expenses, non-food expenses with some specifics as to dollar amount, tips, and a date for when I need to include this. So I would have taken some notes, highlighted the important information, and then in my review phase of the active reading process, I will review the notes, and then from there, I will identify any questions that I need to ask my supervisor, anything I need to make special note of or jot down on my calendar to make sure that I remember the effective date, and any other notes that I need to pay attention to when this policy goes into effect. So in conclusion, the active reading process is simple. You pre-read, read, and review your notes. And through that process, you can begin to better understand and remember the information that you've read in any reading assignment or document with which you interact.